Well, welcome everyone to the National Creativity Network webinar series. My name is George Sugros, and I'm the chair of the National Creativity Network, and will be your host along with my colleague and fellow board member, Wendy Lisko. The National Creativity Network, as you know, is dedicated to fostering imagination and creativity so North America can remain a leader in innovation, free enterprise, and democratic values. We believe the very future of our communities and institutions depends on our ability to nurture imagination and to harness creativity to solve existing problems and to generate new opportunities. The National Creativity Network was created to enhance the flow of ideas, information, and practices across disciplines, and especially between key centers of creativity in education, commerce, and culture. We want to improve the ease with which these centers of creativity can gain access to the best thinking, best questions, and most successful ways of working together. The monthly webinar series is one of our strategies to connect people across North America. We alternate between subjects of interest identified by our membership and open mic sessions where the NCN community can share what they are working on and learn from each other's successes and challenges. So, please mark the third Thursday of every month in your calendar for a guaranteed stimulating conversation around the most pressing issues around the creativity movement. And please let us know if you have a particular topic you want us to cover or if you want an open mic slot in the future. But before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. First, we've put everybody on mute in order to minimize distracting background noise. We will hold questions until the end of the presentation, but you don't need to wait until the end to get in line for your question to be asked. Please send your questions throughout the presentation using the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. My fellow board member Wendy will compile the questions, and we promise to cover as many questions as possible at the end. So now, our featured presentation. We are thrilled to have with us today the best-selling author of How We Decide and the #1 New York Times bestseller, Imagine, How Creativity Works, Jonah Lehrer. Mr. Lehrer shatters the myth of muses, higher powers, even creative types, and demonstrates that creativity is not a single gift possessed by the lucky few. Today, Mr. Lehrer will share the science of creativity and illuminate creativity with a variety of distinct thought processes that we can all learn to use more effectively. And if the most recent visit to Madison is indication, there's a real hunger to hear what Mr. Lehrer's got to say. So thank you for being with us today, Jonah, and to talk about some of the key elements from your new book. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think it's really wonderful that organizations like the National Creativity Network exist, simply because I do think it's so important to get these ideas out there. I don't normally use PowerPoint slides, so I should apologize in advance for the lack of slides, the paucity of slides. But I'd like to talk. My plan is to talk for about a half an hour and then just open the floor to this virtual floor, I should say, to questions. But I'd like to begin with a story about Bob Dylan. It's a story that takes place in the early summer of 1965 when Dylan is just finishing up his tour of England. It's been a grueling few months for the singer as he's been struggling to maintain this nonstop performance schedule. He'd first traveled across the Northeast on a bus, playing in small college towns and big city theaters. Then he crossed over the West Coast and crammed in a hectic few weeks of concerts and promotion. His manager had paraded in front of the press and all these journalist fests, an endless series of inane questions from what is the truth to why is there a cat on the cover of your last album? When Dylan wasn't surly, he was often sarcastic, telling journalists that he collected monkey wrenches, was born in Mexico, that his songs were inspired by chaos, watermelons, and clocks. When he said that last line, there's this wonderful shot of him in Don't Look Back, the D.A. Pennebaker documentary. When he says that last line about watermelons and clocks, you can see he's trying not to smile, but he can't help but smile a little bit. By the time Dylan arrived in London for his UK tour, it was clear that this tour was taking a toll. He was skinny from insomnia, his nails were yellow from nicotine, and his skin had a ghostly pale pallor. Joan Baez said he looked like an underfed angel. For the first time, his solo shows felt formulaic, as if he were singing the lines of someone else. He rarely acknowledged the audience or paused between songs. He seemed to be in a hurry to get off stage. Before long, it all became too much. While touring in England, Dylan decided that he was leading an impossible life. The only talent he cared about, his ceaseless creativity, was being ruined by fame. The breaking point probably came after a brief vacation in Portugal where Dylan came down with a vicious case of food poisoning. The illness forced him to stay in bed for a week, giving the singer a rare chance to reflect. I realized I was very drained, Dylan said. I was playing a lot of songs I didn't want to play. I was singing words I didn't really want to sing. It's very tiring having other people tell you how much they dig you if you yourself don't dig you. The last shows were in London. It was here that Dylan told his manager he was quitting the music business. He was finished with singing and songwriting and was going to move to a tiny cabin in Woodstock, New York. Although he'd become a pop icon, the prophetic poet of his generation, Dylan was ready to renounce it all. He just wanted to be left alone. He wasn't bluffing. As promised, Dylan returned from his British tour and rode his Triumph motorcycle straight out of New York City. He didn't even bring his guitar. Of course, our story doesn't end here. Bob Dylan did not retire in 1965. After just a few relaxing days in Woodstock, when Dylan was most determined to stop creating music, he was overcome with a strange feeling. It's a hard thing to describe, Dylan would say. It's just this sense that you got something to say. So Dylan did the only thing he knew how to do. He grabbed a pencil and pad of paper, and he started to scribble. Once Dylan began, his hand didn't stop moving for the next several hours. I found myself writing this song, this story, this long piece of vomit, 20 pages long, Dylan said. I'd never written anything like that before, and it suddenly came to me that this is what I should do. Vomit is the essential word here. I think Dylan is describing with his characteristic sense a vividness. He always had a way with verbs. The uncontrollable rush of a creative insight, that flow of associations that can't be held back. I don't know where my songs come from, Dylan said. It's like a ghost is writing the song. It gives you the song and it goes away. You don't know what it means. In retrospect, I think we can see that this frantic composition, these words written by the ghost in Woodstock, allowed Dylan to fully express for the very first time the full diversity of his influences. In these lyrics, we can hear his mental blender at work as he mixes together scraps of Blake, Fellini, Woody Guthrie, and Robert Johnson. The song is modernist and pre-modern, it's avant-garde and country western. What Dylan did, and this is why he's Bob Dylan, is find the strange thread connecting these different voices. In those first minutes of writing, he found a way to make something new out of this incongruous list of influences, drawing them together into a catchy song. When Dylan gets to the chorus, and he knows this is the chorus as soon as he commits it to paper, the visceral power of his words becomes obvious. How does it feel to be without a home, like a complete unknown, like a rolling stone? The following week, on June 15, 1965, Dylan brings the sheaf of papers into the cramped space of Studio A, Columbia Records in New York City. After just 4 takes, the musicians were only beginning to learn their parts. Like a Rolling Stone was cut on acetate. Those 6 minutes of raw music would revolutionize rock and roll. The reason I'm talking about Bob Dylan and Like a Rolling Stone this morning is because it's a story about a moment of insight. At times, such stories can feel like romantic cliches, the sort of make-believe breakthroughs that happened to Archimedes in the bathtub and Newton under the apple tree. And yet, moments of insight do happen. They are a genuine mental event. They really are responsible for the theory of gravity and Like a Rolling Stone. In recent years, cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists have made some very interesting progress trying to deconstruct this very, very mysterious mental phenomenon. And it turns out there are 2 defining features of moments of insight. The first defining feature is that the answer arrives when we least expect it. So it comes in the shower. It arrives when we're on a walk. We write our best song after we think we've quit the singing and songwriting business. The second defining feature is that as soon as the answer arrives, we know this is the answer. We know this is the solution we've been searching for. We don't have to double-check the math or contemplate the alternatives. This thought feels like a revelation. It comes attached with a sense of certainty. Now, at first glance, it's not quite clear how one could scientifically study such moments of insight, because you can't just put undergraduates in a brain scanner and say, have an epiphany, we're ready for you, we're collecting data now. That'd be a very inefficient way to actually conduct an experiment. And so instead, scientists have to come up with a way to generate lots of moments of insight on the fly. And today I'll be talking primarily about the research of Mark Beeman at Northwestern and John Kunios at Drexel University. And they pioneered a set of word puzzles called compound remote associate problems. The acronym is a bit unfortunate, CRAP. But the problems go like this. So I believe we do have a sample one. We'll do this one together. The three words are pine, crab, and sauce. And you have to find the fourth word that can form a compound word with pine, crab, and sauce. So I'll give you guys a couple seconds to think about it. Pine, crab, and sauce. The answer in this case is apple, pineapple, crab apple, applesauce. We can do one more for you guys. The three words are age, mile, and sand. What's the fourth word that can form a compound word with age, mile, and sand? In this case, the answer is stone, stone age, milestone, sandstone. And if apple or stone leaps into consciousness, it'll almost certainly arrive as a moment of insight, so your eyes will probably go all wide. You'll probably even say, aha, eureka, I found it. I mean, it's amazing when you watch these experiments take place in the lab. You often see these undergraduates just bolt upright in their chair, and it's like their pupils dilate. They're having these real moments of insight. So the first thing Beeman and Cunha discovered when they would give people these compound remote associate problems inside an fMRI machine is that they saw a sharp spike in activity in the seconds before an insight appeared in a part of the brain called the anterior superior temporal gyrus. It's a part of the brain nobody knows too much about. It's been previously associated with things like the processing of jokes and also the interpretation of metaphors. And this begins to make a little sense, when we're watching Romeo and Juliet. And Romeo says that Juliet is the sun. We know he's not saying that Juliet's a big flaming ball of plasma gas. Instead, we understand he's trafficking in metaphor. And the way we make sense of that metaphor is by looking past all these surface dissimilarities, the fact that Juliet and sons have literally nothing in common, and instead searching for those underlying themes, those remote associations they actually share. So we realize that Romeo is saying that Juliet lights up his world the way the sun lights up ours. Now, when you're trying to make sense of pine, crab, and sauce, a similar mental process is taking place, right? You probably never used pine, crab, and sauce in a sentence before. Those aren't three words that go together very frequently. Yet this one brain area in the back of your head seems to be particularly good at finding this one other word, which in this case is apple, that binds them all together. Now, when you need a moment of insight in the real world, you're working on some difficult problem, you're probably going to rely on an analogous mental process. If the connections were obvious, if they were literal, if they were on the surface, you probably would have found them already. The reason you're so desperately searching for an epiphany is because those connections are subterranean, they're distal, they're not on the surface at all. They're underneath, they're remote. And that's why you need the anterior superior temporal gyrus to find that thin thread that binds these seemingly unrelated ideas together. That's the first thing Beeman and Cunha discovered, is the importance of this brain area in the back of our head, the anterior superior temporal gyrus. Second thing they discovered, along with collaborators at University College of London, is a bit more interesting. And this they discovered when they hooked people up to an EEG machine. It's like wearing a big, bulky shower cap that measures the waves of electricity pouring out of your head. And what they discovered is that they could predict up to 8 seconds in advance whether or not someone's going to have a moment of insight. So now just think for a second how spooky this is. They could look at your EEG waves, and they could look at your brain waves, and they could say, sorry, buddy, I know you're trying hard, but you're wasting your time. You should just go home and save us all a lot of frustration. Or they could say, you know what, in about 7.5 seconds, the odds are looking pretty good that you're going to have a moment of insight. So brace yourself. The question, of course, is what this predictive signal is. It turns out to be something called alpha waves. Like most things in the mind, alpha waves remain pretty mysterious, but they are closely associated with states of relaxation. So things that lead to the production of lots of alpha waves are things like taking a walk on the beach, taking a bubble bath, taking a shower, playing ping pong, having a beer on the couch, doing whatever it is you do that puts your mind at ease, that gets you to stop thinking about those problems at work that you just can't solve. That's probably a place that leads to the production of lots of alpha waves. Now, the reason these states of relaxation are so important, the scientists argue, is that when we're not relaxed, when we've just drunk a triple espresso or chugged some Red Bull, we're chained to our desk, sitting in our cubicle, staring at a computer screen, we're really focused, our attention is out here. It's out in the world. We are consumed by the noise of the world. So we're thinking about pine, crab, and sauce, pine, crab, and sauce. There's probably a wrong answer. Common wrong answer for pine, crab, and sauce is tree, that we just can't get past. And so we feel hopelessly stuck. We're so frustrated. We're not making any progress. And that's why it's so important to allow ourselves, give ourselves a chance to get relaxed. Because it's not until we're relaxed in the shower, being pelted by warm water, we're shampooing our hair, that at long last we let the mind start to wander. We turn the spotlight of attention inwards, and that's when we hear that quiet voice coming from the back of our head telling us the answer is apple, the answer is apple. Maybe that voice has been there for hours or days or weeks. We just haven't taken a moment to listen. Now, I do think there is something quite counterintuitive about this research, and because most people assume that when you give them a very difficult problem, that what they need to do is to focus, that what they need to do is to stay late at the office, to try to pay attention even harder. But that turns out to be exactly backwards. And so the next time you're faced with a very, very difficult problem, a problem that seems impossible, a problem that you just can't solve, a problem that requires a moment of insight, you instead should find a way to relax, to leave the office behind. The answer will only arrive after you stop looking for it. There's this wonderful line of Einstein's that creativity is the residue of wasted time. When you need a moment of insight, you have to make time to waste time. Now, it would be very wonderful if I could tell you that the way to solve every difficult creative problem is to take a shower, to go take a bubble bath, to go on vacation, to have a beer on the couch. In fact, just last month, a study came out showing that when you get undergraduates too drunk to drive, so legally drunk, that they actually solve 30% more of these very difficult creative problems that are solved in moments of insight. So it would be wonderful if I could say that what we should do to solve every creative problem is to have a beer, take a shower. If we don't have an epiphany, then have another beer, take another shower, and so on. But of course, we know that's not the case. We know that in the real world, you also have to put in the work. And sure enough, when you talk to creative people, they often begin by telling you these very romantic stories about their moments of insight, about the epiphany that arrives when they least expected it. But then if you keep on pressing them, they'll begin to confess to all the hard work that came after, how even after they had this great revelation, this big breakthrough, they still have to go through draft after draft, iteration after iteration, edit after edit. As Nietzsche once observed, creators have a vested interest in our believing in the flash of revelation, the so-called inspiration shining down from heavens as a ray of grace. But this is often a lie, Nietzsche wrote. All great artists and thinkers, the most important fact about them is that they are great workers. To illustrate his point, Nietzsche described the musical notebooks of Beethoven, which documented the composer's painstaking process of refining his melodies. It wasn't uncommon for Beethoven to experiment with 70 different versions of a phrase before settling on the final one. The lesson here is that even Beethoven, the cliché of artistic genius, still needed to constantly refine his ideas, struggling with his music until the beauty shone through. Let's not sugarcoat. This rejecting process isn't fun. It's the red pen on the page and the discarded sketch, the trash prototype, and the failed first draft. Nevertheless, such a merciless process is sometimes the only way forward. We keep on thinking and paying attention because our next thought might be the answer. So what defines this style of creativity? What allows some people to go through 70 different versions of a single musical phrase? At first glance, the answer isn't clear. And this speaks to a larger mystery, a larger long-standing mystery in psychology, which is that it's been very tough for psychologists to identify what defines highly successful creative people. Those epic creators on the far right side of the bell curve. People like Bob Dylan, like Pablo Picasso, like Steve Jobs. What makes them different from the rest of it? What separates them from you and I? And for a long time, the answer just hasn't been clear. You can give these people an IQ test, intelligence test, and it turns out they're not smarter than the rest of us. Their IQ scores are perfectly normal. And you can give them a battery of old-fashioned personality tests, Myers-Briggs and all the rest, and once again, they'll look pretty normal. They may be a little bit more open to experience, a little bit more extroverted, but that's about it. Nothing shocking. But I think in recent years, psychologists have begun to identify one character trait in particular that defines highly successful creative people. and that's a character trait called grit. G-R-I-T. It's not an acronym. It is what it sounds like. It's about single-mindedness. It's about persistence. It's about, the stubborn refusal to quit. I'm thinking here of someone like J.K. Rowling, who suffered through 12 rejections from publishers. Every single UK publisher said this book is worthless, and yet she kept on writing about this boy wizard in coffee shops while her baby daughter napped. That right there is grit. Now, the best way to tell you about why grit matters, tell you the story of how grit was first discovered. So it takes place at West Point in 2004. And for years, going back to the 1960s, West Point had this problem that somewhere between 5 and 10% of first-year cadets would drop out during the initial 6 weeks. It's a tough time at West Point known as Beast Barracks, or the Beast. It's where they try to turn these soft citizens into hardened soldiers. So you get your head shaved, go on long runs, you get woken up at the wee hours of the morning. It's designed to be deliberately tough, but sometimes it's too tough. And so they were losing upwards of 5% of their class right away during the first summer. And this is a big problem for West Point because there are no transfer students. So these are future leaders of the Army who the Army wanted to groom, who were just dropping like flies. So West Point had tried for years to find some way to predict retention. They looked at all sorts of different metrics, looked at SAT scores, IQ scores, high school rank, measured the physical fitness. They did one-on-one interviews. Nothing worked. They couldn't identify those kids who were at highest risk of dropping out. So in desperation, in 2004, they came to a psychologist named Angela Duckworth. At the time she was a grad student at the University of Pennsylvania. She's now an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And they said, can you help us? Can you come up with some measure that will allow us to successfully predict retention? She came up with a short survey called the Grit-O survey. It takes about 3 minutes to complete, asks questions in 2 different domains. The first domain is, how single-minded are you? Have you always wanted to go to West Point? Have you always wanted to be a painter, a poet, a novelist, a computer scientist, an entrepreneur, whatever it is? Is this a goal you've had for a long time? The second domain is, how do you react to the inevitable frustrations and failures along the way? Are they a sign that you should double down and try even harder? Are they a sign that you should try something new, that maybe you should pivot? This is the world telling you you're just not cut out for this goal, find a new one. So she has those sorts of questions. It's a self-assessment, so it's inherently limited. If you're being tested for grit, it's pretty easy to figure out what the grittiest answer is. So that's why West Point gives it to every kid on the second day of West Point. In between, it's like 13 hours of psychometric testing, and they just, put this 3-minute test in, so kids don't really know what they're being asked about, so they tend to give very honest answers. And what West Point discovered in 2004 is that the Grit-O survey is the first test that it had ever used that allowed it to successfully predict retention. They've used it every year since, and it's worked every single year. Now, since 2004, Duckworth and colleagues have gone on to show that in field after field, grit is often the single best predictor of success. So if you're trying to figure out which 12-year-olds are most likely to win the National Spelling Bee, turns out it's not the smartest 12-year-olds, not the ones with the best grades, the highest IQ scores. It's the ones with the highest levels of grit. Why? Because grit mediates deliberate practice. Grit allows us to practice the right way, which is not the fun way. If you're trying to figure out which real estate agents are most likely to stick with the business through a downturn and make the most sales, it's the ones with the highest levels of grit. Which amateur golfers are most likely to make the PGA Tour 7 years down the road, not the ones with the longest drives or the best putts. It's the ones with the highest levels of grit. Which teachers at Teach for America are most likely to stick with it through 2 years in an inner-city public school and going to lead to the biggest boost in standardized test scores among their students. It's the ones with the highest levels of grit. Which applicants to Wharton Business School are going to get the best grades, going to be most successful after they graduate. It's the ones with the highest levels of grit. That in field after field, it turns out that grit is often a better predictor of who's successful and who's not, explains a bigger percentage of the variation in success than just about any other measure we have, than intelligence, than other personality traits. And that's because grit allows us to stick with something. It allows us to have a goal, to believe in that goal, and to keep on working even when other people tell us we're not cut out for it, even when we're surrounded by negative feedback, even when we make mistakes and we've got to learn from them. Grit allows us to stay on task. It allows us to keep going. Now, I would argue that grit is particularly important in creative domains. That's because in the 21st century, to come up with a new idea in this world so crowded with other stuff, you're going to need to be gritty, right? If it were easy to invent a new patent or to write a new novel or to write that poem or to invent that gadget, it would already exist. That idea would already have been made real. And that's why to make something new in this day and age, you're going to have to stick with it. You're going to have to suffer through the naysayers. You're going to have to stick with the frustrations and the failures. You're going to have to go through draft after draft, iteration after iteration. And to make it through a process like that, you're going to need lots and lots of grit. There's this wonderful line of Woody Allen's that 80% of success is just showing up. Well, grit is what allows us to show up again and again. So far, I've been attempting to describe these two distinct forms of creativity which depend on very distinct mental processes in the brain. The more practical lesson, though, is that different kinds of creative problems benefit from different kinds of creative thinking. The question, of course, is how to adjust our thought process to the task at hand. When should we daydream and take warm showers, and when should we drink another cup of coffee? What requires relaxation and what requires grit? The good news, and this is very good news, is that the human mind has a natural ability to diagnose our problems, to assess the kind of creativity we need. These assessments have a very eloquent name. They're called feelings of knowing, and they occur whenever we suspect that we can find the answer if only we keep on thinking about it. One of my favorite examples of a feeling of knowing is when a word is on the tip of your tongue. It's a very frustrating mental hiccup. You're walking down the street and you see someone, and you know their name, but you just can't quite place it. On the one hand, this drives me crazy. It is so frustrating. But it's also kind of profound, because how do you know something if you don't actually know it? Why are you so convinced that you can find that answer? You can remember that name if you can't actually remember it, if you can't find that file in those overstuffed filing cabinets inside your head. And here's where feelings of knowing prove essential. A feeling of knowing is a hunch reminding you that if you just keep on searching for that name, eventually in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, you will recover it. You will locate that missing word. Now, when it comes to creative problems, feelings of knowing turn out to be a very, very useful diagnostic guide. Study after study has shown that for various kinds of creative problems, people are remarkably accurate, upwards of 85% accuracy, at saying, looking at a creative problem, just glancing at it pretty quickly and saying, yep, I can solve that problem within a given time frame. I can get you the answer within an hour, within a week, within a month, whatever it is. We can just look at a problem and know that it's within our reach. Now, what makes these feelings of knowing for creativity even more useful is that they come attached with a sense of progress. So as we're working on that creative problem, we're able to say whether or not we're getting closer to the answer, even though we don't know what the answer is. I mean, just think how amazing that is. It's like being dropped into a strange city. We have no idea where we're trying to get to, and yet we're able to say, if I make this left-hand turn, I am somehow headed in the right direction. It's a pretty wondrous talent. Now, I think we should be able to use these feelings of knowing to actually figure out how we should be thinking at different parts of the creative process. So let's say you've been working on a problem for a while and you've had a feeling of knowing, you've made lots of progress, but then you hit the wall. All of a sudden, that feeling of knowing disappears. Now the problem seems impossible. Again, that's not going to be fun. That's a deeply unpleasant and frightening part of the creative process. But that's your brain telling you that you need a moment of insight. So when you hit the wall, when you are stuck in something, you have to embrace it. You've got to go on vacation. You've got to take an extra long shower. You've got to go to that place that's going to increase alpha waves. The most productive thing you can do is forget all about work. But let's say you're working on a problem and you've got a feeling of knowing. You feel like you're making progress. You feel like you are slowly unconcealing the problem. That is your brain telling you to keep on working, to drink that espresso, to get juiced on caffeine, to stay focused, to stay late at the office, to keep on putting in the work, to rely on those muscles of grit that allow you to keep on working, keep on plugging away at it. Before long, that feeling of knowing will become actual knowledge. The last idea I'd like to talk about today is a provocative one, and it speaks directly, I think, to the difficulty of fostering innovation. In fact, it suggests that many of the things we do with the best of intentions, such as brainstorming or the hiring of chief innovation officers, that they may actually sometimes get in the way. They actually may hinder our natural creativity. I think this is best demonstrated by a very provocative analogy made by Geoffrey West. He's a theoretical physicist at the Santa Fe Institute, and in the book I talk extensively about his research on cities. He wants to understand what makes cities tick and why some cities tick better than others. So he's found all sorts of fascinating correlations. One of my favorites is that if you're trying to figure out the single most predictive variable of patents per capita in a given metropolis, why some cities produce more patents per capita than others, it turns out to be the walking speed of pedestrians. I mean, this is befuddling, right? It's something no one would have predicted, and I think there's a good chance it's just a statistical fluke. But Geoffrey West argues it, in a sense, makes some sense, that the real function of a city is to smash people together, to force us to interact, to mix and mingle, and to start up a conversation with a stranger on the sidewalk while waiting in line for a latte. That right there is why cities exist. And so West argues, in a sense, you can model people as particles. And if you increase the velocity of those particles, if you get those pedestrians to walk a little bit faster, then you get more bumps. And eventually those bumps add up. Every once in a while they lead to a new patent. So maybe that's why you see this correlation exist. But West makes this very interesting comparison between cities and companies. He points out that from a certain perspective, cities and companies look quite similar, right? They're both big social organizations, lots of infrastructure and a fixed physical space. And yet cities and companies exhibit one very interesting difference, which is that cities never die. Cities are immortal. Cities live forever. You can nuke a city, comes back. Flood a city, comes back. You can have a devastating earthquake and burn the city to the ground, and yet we still have San Francisco. Companies, on the other hand, are incredibly fragile and fleeting. Companies die all the time. Even the biggest companies in the world die. The average lifespan of a Fortune 100 firm, these huge multinational companies, less than 45 years. Only 2 companies in the original Dow Jones Index are still around. Nearly 25% of Fortune 500 firms die every decade. So West wants to understand, what's the difference? Why are cities immortal and companies so fleeting? Well, by gathering vast tracts of statistics from all across the world, from the Census Bureau and the Patent Office and lots of foreign governments, he's found an interesting difference, and the difference is this. As cities get bigger, as that metropolis swells in size, everyone in that city becomes more productive. They invent more patents per capita, more trademarks per capita. They're going to make more money, so you see higher income in bigger cities. And this is a process known as superlinear scaling. It means the productivity chart of a city looks like a roller coaster taking off into the sky. And West argues this is why our cities keep on getting bigger. This is why urbanization is the great theme of the 21st century. It's why more people are going to move to cities in the next 100 years than have moved to cities in all of human history. It's why by the end of the 21st century, nearly 80% of the world will be urbanized. It's this trend, superlinear scaling, the fact that big cities make us smarter and more productive. That is why our cities keep on getting bigger. But companies exhibit the opposite trend. As a company gets bigger, everyone in that company becomes less productive. So you see fewer patents per employee, fewer trademarks per employee, less profit per employee. And over time, this becomes a very dangerous trend, right? Because Wall Street's always saying, grow the bottom line, keep on getting bigger. And that's what companies try to do. So they get these expanded fixed costs, these expensive bureaucracies, but they're no longer innovating at the same rate. So they become more reliant on their old ideas. For their new ideas, they've got to invest in expensive acquisitions. But one day, those old ideas will no longer be useful. And sometimes those expensive acquisitions won't pan out. And that is when companies die. That is why companies go belly up. They are, in a sense, killed by their need to keep on growing, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that as they grow, they become less innovative at the per capita level. Now, what explains this difference? Why are cities superlinear while companies are sublinear? West argues it's because companies get in the way. That when you think about a city, the magic of a city is that it's a freewheeling, chaotic place. A mayor can tell us where to live or who to talk to or what problems to work on. A city is just a bunch of strangers bumping into each other. That because cities don't try to maximize creativity, that's exactly what they do. Companies, on the other hand, they try to micromanage the process. They tell us to brainstorm when brainstorming doesn't work. They stifle horizontal interactions and become these very vertical places. They try to micromanage the individual minds. They'll tell us, don't daydream. Don't have a beer in the afternoon. Don't go on a long, relaxing walk. Focus, focus, focus. Stay in your cubicle and look at your computer screen. They silo knowledge. They do all these things, many of which are done with the best of intentions, with these attempts to make us more creative, and yet they actually hold us back. They hinder our natural ability to innovate and imagine new things. So West's advice is simple. When in doubt, imitate the city. In closing, the imagination has always seemed like a magic trick of matter, which is probably why we've always blamed our best ideas on the muses. The good news is that by finally understanding where our new ideas come from, we can hopefully have more of them. The science of creativity can make us a little bit more creative. But we must also be honest. The creative process will never be easy no matter how much we know about neurons or cities. The science of the imagination doesn't fit neatly on a PowerPoint slide, and it can't be summarized in a subtitle. If creativity were that easy, Bob Dylan wouldn't be so famous, and the process wouldn't require so much grit. Despite all the clever studies and rigorous experiments, our most essential talent remains our most mysterious. The mystery is this. Although the imagination is inspired by the everyday world, by its flaws and its beauties, we are somehow able to see beyond our sources, to imagine things that only exist in the mind. There was nothing, now there's something. It's almost like magic. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And now for my favorite part, I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Well, thank you, Jonah. That was very stimulating, and we clearly got a lot of ideas and questions from your presentation. So I'm going to just jump right in.
Great.
So, I think we have to start with the terminology a bit, in part because the National Creativity Network talks a lot about imagination, creativity, and innovation. And I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about what you think the difference is between imagination and creativity.
I've gotten a lot of questions just while I've been talking about the book, especially on book tour, between how one parses the definition between imagination and creativity and innovation. And these are questions I wrestled a lot with during the writing of the book, simply because I think we intuitively have this notion that there must be some difference. I think especially for the creativity innovation question, I think people generally see innovation as more applied, more practical creativity, somehow more artistic. And I think the same thing probably is true, imagination being the, in a sense, least applied. If we look at all these different verbs on this scale of, on the one hand we've got the poet, on the other hand we've got the inventor in the Silicon Valley garage. The inventor is the innovator, the poet is the guy using his imagination. And eventually, at a certain point I realized that what I was most interested in doing is actually collapsing these distinctions. I think one thing that draws me to the brain is the brain's a great category buster. The brain shows us that these rigid categories that we cling to in the world, the fact that artists must think differently than scientists and inventors, that doesn't actually hold when you look at what's happening inside our head. You realize that, creativity is a bundle of distinct mental processes, and that everyone relies on the same ones. Whether you're a poet or you're a painter or you're a chemist or you're a computer programmer, that I think the brain kind of shows us what they have in common. And so, to answer your question, I think the way we use these words in everyday language, they definitely have slightly different connotations, but I'm more interested in showing that they actually are really the same basic thing, that the imagination is the imagination no matter what end you're putting it towards. If it doesn't matter if you're filing a patent or writing a poem, that you're still relying on moments of insight, and you're still going to rely on lots of grit.
Thank you. Perfect. Well, you were talking a lot about cities and how they compare to companies, and I think a lot of people had some questions around education because our schools are actually adequately preparing our students for the companies that you described. And I think as education reform leads us down a path where there's even more assessment of not only students but also teachers and principals, we're probably getting closer to more testing in our schools.
Yeah.
And people were really interested in, I guess there are multiple questions here, but how does this research influence, or can we impact this current trend in education reform?
You know, it's a really, really important question, and I do think that the science of creativity really should change the way we engage with students in the classroom. I think one of the things that the science of creativity teaches us is that right now we've got this very narrow model of what productive thinking looks like. So one of the first lessons we teach our kids right in second grade is stop daydreaming, stop looking out the window, focus, look at the blackboard. And sometimes it's essential, right? When you've got a feeling of knowing, it's important to know how to focus, be able to pay attention to a problem and keep on working at it until it's done. And yet I think we also have to realize that sometimes that's not what you want to do, that we also have to teach our kids how to daydream, how to be productive daydreamers, that it's not an accident that people who daydream more score much higher on tests of creativity. So we also have to teach those skills. We have to teach them sometimes to relax, to teach them how to effectively collaborate. That obviously there are very good reasons why we should have standardized testing, and this isn't to say we should stop focusing on literacy and arithmetic. Assessments can be very, very useful, but I think we shouldn't become so obsessed with this one narrow model of cognition, which is the ability to focus on a tedious task in a sense, and pretend that that'll somehow make our kids more creative, that'll solve every creative problem. What makes the mind so interesting is that it's got all these different ways of thinking, each of which are useful in different circumstances. We have to make sure our kids are getting the full spectrum of getting the most out of their mind, learning how to use, to the fullest capacity these 3.5 pounds of meat inside their head. So that's one thing to say. I mean, I think the other thing to say about this drive towards standardized testing, in a sense teaching to the test, is when you ask Angela, the scientist, psychologist at Penn who has really pioneered the study of grit, when you ask her, what's the best way to build grit up in our kids? We know it's incredibly important, but how can we teach it? Because we also know it's a malleable trait, that it's about 50% nature, 50% nurture. So we can do a lot to shift the bell curve. And she's got this wonderful maxim. I mean, right now she's studying kids in the Philadelphia district schools, trying to figure out how to build grit up directly, trying to figure out what grittier kids do that kids with less grit don't do, so we can teach those skills. But in the meantime, before she's got concrete answers, she's got this wonderful maxim, which is choose easy, work hard. That it's very important to expose our kids to a menu of possibilities at an early age that they might fall in love with. So, this to me is a great justification for arts education. It's important to expose our kids to painting, to drawing, to sculpture, to ballet, to soccer, to basketball, to chemistry, to computer programming, whatever it is. Expose them to lots of different activities and encourage them to choose the one that feels easiest, that feels like the most fun, that feels like play, not like work. Because, right, that's a sign. The not having to exert lots of effort is a sign, at least at first, that they've got a natural aptitude for it. But then, once they choose easy, we have to remind them every single day to work hard. That getting good at that is going to require lots of effort. It's going to require 10,000 hours plus or minus 5,000 hours of practice. It's going to require the ability to persist through frustration and failure. So we have to remind them to work hard. But for now, I think, the one thing we're not doing at all is letting our kids choose easy. Of course, when budgets are tight, the very first thing that's always cut is, all these so-called soft extracurricular activities, things like arts education, things like hands-on, science research, actually getting to play in a science lab. And that's a shame, because I think if we want to build up these so-called non-cognitive skills like grit that we know are incredibly important, then I think choosing easy is a big part of the process.
And so have you found in your research any strong indications that if teachers would actually do that, they would do better on tests? They would improve their test scores?
No one's done that work yet. I mean, Angela is just beginning a big longitudinal study of high school students in the Philadelphia public schools. The data she's got so far really just show that grit matters. So she's done some big studies. They gave her grit survey to every middle school and high school student in the Chicago public schools, and what she found is that grit was a great predictor of success. Grit was the best predictor of high school retention, whether or not kids would graduate. So what she's trying to do now, she's going to the Philadelphia district schools, which is, of course, a very troubled school district, and she's looking at those kids who have made it to their senior year. So about 40 to 45% of kids drop out before they get there. Those kids score lower in grit. So she's already looking at a grittier subsample. And what she's found is that about 95% of these high school students, over the course of their high school career, their test scores get worse. This is it's a deeply depressing set of statistics. And the more time they spend in the classroom, the farther they fall behind their peers in Pennsylvania. She's focusing on the 5% of kids who somehow make themselves better. Even though they come from these same struggling schools, these same poor communities, they often have little household support, they somehow find a way to improve their scores. Sure enough, these kids score off the charts on grit, but she's trying to figure out, what does it actually mean? How does that cash out in the world? And so far, some of her very, very initial evidence is stuff like these kids tend to have exemplars in mind, that when they're stuck on a problem, when they're frustrated, when they need to be gritty, they think about a role model. Maybe it's Martin Luther King, maybe it's their grandmother, maybe it's Kobe Bryant. Who knows? They think about someone who they know in their mind had to persist and persevere, had to get over the hump of frustration. That's what made them successful. So, I think one thing we need to do is do a better job of giving our kids exemplars. That I think this is one of the things that it'd be so easy to cut from the classroom, right? We got to teach our kids literacy, teach them how to read, teach them arithmetic. That's important. And yet you often find for these kids, having these narratives, these inspiring narratives, is a big part of what allows them to put in the work.
So when you talk about the other subject matters, people were also asking about STEM in particular, those science, technology, engineering, and math, and this new movement where the arts have been part of integrating integrating the arts into those subject matters. And do you see that as a valid approach to improving how we teach the sciences? And
I think I think the STEM to STEAM movement is a wonderful idea. I think it's very important. If nothing else, it just teaches kids to be a little less respectful of these disciplinary boundaries. Just the very way we teach kids from elementary school all the way through college, and it gets even worse as you progress. So by graduate school, you have been funneled into this very narrow niche. We teach them to pursue these very narrow disciplines, and of course that's necessary. You need to become an expert in a specific domain. But what the research suggests in the 21st century, it's all about cutting across those boundaries. It's all about those cross-cutting connections. It's all about getting people from different disciplines to collaborate. There's some wonderful work by Ben Jones, who's an economist at Northwestern, who he data mined 20 million papers published over the course of the 20th century. And what he found is you go back to the 1950s and you look at the most important papers in a given scientific field, that they're almost always the product of a lone researcher, someone who all by themselves shifted the paradigm. Think Einstein, think Darwin, someone like that. But you fast forward to the 21st century, and now science looks very, very different. That now the most important papers in the field are almost always the product of a team. These teams are getting bigger by about 20% per decade. And these teams almost always involve people from different disciplines, from different backgrounds coming together. Now, the reason this trend exists, Jones argued, is because our problems are getting harder. The low-hanging fruit is gone. That many of the problems and challenges that remain exceed the capabilities of the individual imagination. So we either have to learn how to work together or fail alone. And that's why I think it's so important to encourage kids from these from the earliest ages to realize that, the arts can be part of the sciences. It's important to learn how to blur boundaries, to incorporate all these different disciplines into an activity, so that you should think about chemistry when you're cooking, when you're sautéing an onion, and when you're making a painting, you should think about the chemistry of those pigments. To I think, to be less respectful of these arbitrary, disciplines that we impose upon the world. So I think the turning STEM into STEAM is a great idea.
Good, because there is that movement going on, and then it's a matter really of just figuring out how to convince everybody above, who's controlling the curriculum.
That's always the question. And I think one thing schools can learn from cities is this idea of really encouraging horizontal interactions. I think schools, and I'm talking especially about higher education institutions, they tend to become very vertical places. They silo knowledge. They keep people within their departments. Even if, in theory, they try to encourage interdisciplinary collaborations, they're often very hard to execute for all sorts of inane bureaucratic reasons. So universities, I think, can too often resemble big bureaucratic companies. And that's a bad thing, because universities, I think they should really try to be more like a city. They should really just try to let people make these cross-cutting connections, just have those random bumps. That's what makes cities so vibrant, and I think educational institutions can learn a lot from them.
So could you get a little more specific on how you think we can do that, how we can do that in our workplaces, in our schools, and in our towns? How do we get that movement started?
It's difficult. I think one of the messages that cities teach us is that a lot of our best ideas, a lot of innovation bubbles up from below. So it's bottom up. It's hard to manage in a top-down process. So the most vibrant cities, what makes them so vibrant, as I said, is that mayors can't micromanage a town or a city. They can't tell people where to live or who to talk to. And that can often be frustrating, but it turns out to be a great thing. So I think as managers, for instance, whether we're a principal of a school or the president of a university or the CEO of a company, I think we should, try to do a little bit better job of, in a sense, getting out of the way, of encouraging people to make cross-cutting connections, to interact with each other, to have small talk by the coffee machine, to realize that, so often we're all about efficiency. We're about maximizing efficiency. So we've got all these metrics that help us do that, and that's, of course, very useful at times. But when it comes to trying to maximize creativity, the name of the game isn't maximizing efficiency. It's all about serendipity. And I think serendipity, by definition, is going to be much harder to foment in a top-down manner, because serendipity is there's no rational process that can predict it. There's no algorithm that can map it out for you. It's simply about encouraging people to bump into each other. One of my favorite examples of this comes from the Pixar studios, which were largely designed by Steve Jobs. And the original plan for the Pixar studios called for 3 separate buildings. There'd be one building for the animators, one building for the computer scientists, one building for everyone else, the writers, editors, and so on. According to legend, Jobs took one look at this and said, that's a terrible idea. He ripped it up in front of the architect. Jobs realized that even though that plan was much more efficient, the success of Pixar would depend on getting people in these different disciplines to collaborate, to make cross-cutting connections. So he insisted everyone be in the same building. But he realized that wasn't enough. So then he carved out this big lobby at the center of the building, and he started putting everything important in the lobby. He put the gift store there, and the mailboxes there, and the coffee shop there, and the cafeteria there. But he realized, what? Even that's not enough, because you could build people, they love the cafeteria, but the animators would still have lunch with the animators and so on. So then in one of his moments of insight, he decided there'd be only 2 bathrooms in the entire Pixar studios, and he put those in the atrium. Because if there's one place we all have to go every day, it's the bathroom. And at first, people thought this was such a ridiculous idea, right? Because if you work at the far end of the building, it's like a 5-minute walk to the bathroom. It's not efficient at all. And yet now when you talk to people at Pixar, you hear again and again these stories of these bathroom breakthroughs, that great conversation they had while washing their hands at the sink, or that serendipitous chat on the way to the bathroom in the hallway. So in a sense, I think we have to think more in those terms, to realize that sometimes, even if it's inefficient, it helps to make people walk a little bit farther to the bathroom so that you can have more of those serendipitous moments.
That's terrific. If we have a group of people here who have been investing in their lives to creativity and their cities and the commerce and education and culture, and trying to grow a movement. Could you give some advice on how we can grow that movement? It's a really important question. I think one of the things that's been most gratifying, just being on book tours, I think the tremendous amount of
interest there is in creativity. And I think this is for a million different reasons. I mean, I think it's everything from we're just emerging, hopefully, from the severe economic downturn. I think people are coming back to realize that, sustainable economic growth is in the end about new ideas. You can kind of trick the macroeconomic gods for a couple years with bubbles of all different sorts. But in the end, if you want sustainable growth, it's about innovation. It's about creativity. It's about teaching people how to have more new ideas. So it's about improving our classrooms. It's about fixing the patent system. It's about having better companies. So it's all those things. So I've personally been gratified by just how much I think interest there is in this subject. In terms of how to build a movement around this, I mean, my own personal strategy, I think, is to try to use science to make a case for this. Simply because I think creativity is something that's easy to give lip service to. I think it's a lot harder to execute in the real world, simply because a lot of what it requires us to do is to make longer trips to the bathroom. It's about executives and college presidents getting out of the way. It's about making time to look unproductive, to daydream, sometimes turning off our phone, being a little less connected. Things that I think in our current world look like we're goofing off, look like we're just wasting time, and yet that turns out to often be essential. So one thing I try to do is to use the science to say, look, we've rigged our world sometimes in the wrong ways. So we have to really reevaluate, I think, from the bottom up, how we do things. So that's, I think, one way I've tried to not, of course, start a movement, but just try to change the conversation to get people to think differently about this. So we're not just, everyone is for creativity. Everyone thinks creativity is a good thing. The question is that I think to really become more creative, to really maximize our imaginative potential, we have to do stuff that at the moment seems quite counterintuitive and seems like the opposite of productivity. So I think that's why I think the science can be helpful.
And we can find much of that science outlined in your book?
Yeah, the book talks about moments of insight. It talks about how to get better at focusing when we need to be gritty. It's all with stories about Bob Dylan and Yo-Yo Ma and W.H. Auden and Pixar and all the rest. But one thing I tried to do in the book, it's not just make it about the brain. I mean, I think I began writing the book just thinking, this will just be about the neuroscience of creativity. But of course, when you start thinking about creativity, you very quickly discover it's not just about the brain. It's also about our teams. It's about collaborations. It's about how to structure group conversation. It's about cities. The cities we live in play a huge role in our creative output. It's about cultures. It's about how to create a culture of excess genius. That's the historical term for these historical moments like ancient Athens or Renaissance Florence or Elizabethan England, where you don't just get one genius, you get this sudden flourishing of geniuses. How can we create one of those cultures? So those are some of the ideas I discussed in the book.
Well, we thank you very much for being with us today, and I'm going to hand this back over to George.
Jonah, let me add my voice and everybody else's to Wendy's and say thank you so much for
my
taking
pleasure.
the time
It's a lot
to
of
be
fun.
with
Thank
us.
you.
And so make sure you visit Jonah's website, jonahlehrer.com, or amazon.com if you're interested in picking up a copy of the book and getting more of those details for your movements in your communities. So look forward to that. Also, I want to let you know to save the dates for the third Thursday of every month for upcoming webinars. We're excited to announce that on June 17th, we'll continue our exploration of intelligence, creativity, and wisdom with scholar Bob Sternberg, Provost, Senior Vice President, and Regents Professor of Psychology and Education at Oklahoma State University. And after a summer hiatus, we'll return in September with a webinar featuring our founding chair, Sir Ken Robinson. So remember to stay connected and like us on Facebook and follow us on our new Twitter account at NCreativityN, and we've certainly followed Jonah, so he's one of the people we're following at NCN. And check out our website where you'll find the recording of today's webinar and archived webinars from our past webinar series. So we hope you have a fantastic day and stay creative out there. We'll look forward to talking with you in June. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Jonah.
Thank you.
Wendy.